Hi, I'm Julian. I'm a lecturer in plant ecology and biogeography.
And I'm Connie. I'm an ecologist and digital creator.
We're interested in all sorts of ecological and evolutionary questions.
And that's why we founded EcolClips.
Invasive species often show rapid population growth, outcompeting native species and disrupting local biodiversity. Understanding their dynamics involves studying factors such as reproductive rates, dispersal mechanisms, and interactions with native species. Phylogeography helps in understanding these dynamics by exploring historical processes and genetic variations that have influenced the distribution and evolution over time and across regions. This knowledge is essential for developing effective strategies to control the ecological and economic impact of invasive species on natural environments. To learn more about population dynamics of invasive species and their effect on native fauna, we talked to Professor Jaco Roux from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Jaco is an evolutionary biologist focusing on the population dynamics of invasive species, plant evolutionary biology and biogeography. He is specifically interested in understanding aspects related to the phylogeography and population structure of invasive plants.
Jaco, tell us, what is phylogeography and why is it useful for understanding species invasions?
So phylogeography is studying the historical processes that shaped evolutionary lineages within a species. So it was first become a field after John Avis in the US studied gophers, and he looked at restriction patterns of genomic DNA to delineate different lineages of the same species. So once you know that, you can start inferring what is causing those patterns of diversification at the genetic level. So things like vicariance or dispersal, barriers to dispersal, and so forth. So what does this have to do with invasive species? Well, quite a lot. So for us to understand species that have been introduced by humans, that have become naturalized and then start spreading, we often need to know what the drivers are of those species becoming invasive in the new range. We know one of the most important factors that determines invasiveness is what we call propagal pressure. And that simply refers to the number of introduction events and the size of those introduction events. So if we study the phylogeography of invasive species in their native ranges, so we look at historical patterns of genetic diversification, we can infer as a proxy propagal pressure based on the number of genetic lineages that you find in the new range, for example, or the amount of genetic diversity that you find in that new range. So it's just one example of how we can use genetic approaches to better understand not only the evolutionary history of species, but also their success in novel environments.
Mm-hmm. So evolutionary responses in invasive species are well documented. But what do we know about native species responding to the invaders?
Yeah, so there's been a huge influx in research, as you rightly pointed out, looking at how invasive species evolve to become invasive. I think they provide us with the best examples of rapid contemporary evolution. So things changing over a few generations on ecological timescales, not evolutionary timescales. I think it's fascinating because even the very famous pepper moth example was always thought of as being too unnatural to be actually considered a product of natural selection, which of course we now know is not true. So getting back to your question, we also know that native species are responding evolutionarily to the presence of invasive species. Invasive species by definition would be extremely widespread in the new environment. And therefore, they become resources that are uncontested. So in other words, if you are able to utilize that resource, there might be a huge fitness advantage to you as a native species. The ease and the rapidness of these evolutionary responses in native species depend on their phylogeography and evolutionary history. So for example, lots of herbivores are specialists, even though they're polyphagous, they may be specialists of certain families of plants that they only feed on. So in other words, if an invasive species is introduced that belongs to the same family as some native plants, the enemies of those native plants may eventually adopt the new resource that is uncontested and widespread and abundant. So some of the work that we're doing here in Australia is looking at those host shifts of native insects, abandoning their native host plants and adopting their new host plants in the form of invasive species. And that frequency of interaction may be quite high, and that will then determine the response evolutionarily in these native species. So the example that I might discuss in a moment involves an insect that uses its proboscis, so its beak, to pierce through the capsules of fruit to get to the seed, and it rapidly evolved longer proboscides in order to utilize an invasive species.
Do you think we can use this knowledge for conservation biology and management of invasive species? If we do have these natives that can also probably act as biological control agents here.
This is the example that I was talking about earlier. This is an invasive vine in the genus Cardiospermum. That's actually one of the weeds of national significance in Australia. So it's really widespread and it's very impactful. And this is an interesting plant because, as you can see, it has these massive balloons and it carries its seeds right in the center of these balloons. So insects can utilize these seeds when the fruit is intact by reaching the seeds, obviously, on the inside. And this can prove to be quite a challenge for many insects because it's a very effective mechanical defense mechanism from the plant's point of view. So the insect in Australia that has adopted this particular invasive species is called Leptocorus gallicus, and it is a mipteran, and it has a very long proboscis, so very long beak. In order to utilize its normal native host plant, so this is an example of Electrion tomentosus, but if we break open this seed here, you can see that the thickness of the seed coat is very, very different from the distance to seed in this new host plant. So in order to efficiently utilize this new host plant, we have documented evidence that these insects very rapidly, over less than 100 years, evolved longer proboscides in order to utilize this particular host plant. We also have evidence that the insects enjoy a higher fitness on this host plant, so they actually produce more offspring when grown on a diet of the invasive host plant, which is probably to do with chemical defenses and differences in those defenses between these different host plants. So to get back to your question about management, part of the work that we're doing here at the university at the moment is to further select for longer proboscides in these insects. Why do we want to do that? Well, we know when we measure the distance from the side of the fruit to the actual seed and the average proboscis length, that there's still a bit of a mismatch. So in other words, these insects have evolved in response to this novel resource, but the trait match is still slightly suboptimal. So the work that we're doing here at Macquarie University involves artificially selecting these insects for longer proboscides with the aim of creating a native insect that can potentially control this invasive species. From the phylogeography aspect of invasive species that we spoke about at the beginning, that kind of information also feeds back into the management substantially of invasive species. The example here would be classical biological control, which would be identifying natural enemies of the invasive species in its native range and then introducing it in the invasive range to control that plant. Now, many plants will have very specific, specialized natural enemies, and those are the ones that you want to introduce into a new country. Why? Because you don't want those enemies to also attack crop plants or native species that are closely related to the invader. And quite often the relationships between these specialist natural enemies and particular species of plants is so tight that you may get what is called the development of biotypes, for example. So in other words, certain lineages of an insect species may only feed on certain lineages of a specific host plant. And in that instance, knowing the phylogeography of both the host plant and the insect in the native range can assist in matching the best possible insect to introduce in the invasive range. And there's lots of good examples of this kind of work. So Lygodium, which is a highly invasive vine, has a wide native range distribution. And the mite that has been introduced as a biocontrol agent actually came from Queensland, because that was the source of the invasive populations in the US. So that's a good example of how you can use phylogeography to assist management of invasive species.
So Jaco, in your opinion, what are the most pressing research questions in evolutionary ecology of invasive species today?
Yeah, that's a good question, and not an easy one to answer. I think the evolutionary ecology of invasive species, like everything else in biology, is hugely context dependent. So when you study the same species in different environments, you're likely to get a very different answer using the same approaches. I think there's lots of invaders that do have a cosmopolitan distribution, so you can find them in many, many places around the world. And I think these represent some of the best systems to study for similar patterns and evolutionary responses in invasive species. So in other words, convergent evolution in different environments. And I think that would be a very interesting topic to study in the future. So for example, the example that we discussed about invasive balloon vines and Leptocorus insects has been replicated in places like Africa. So in Africa, there's also a native Leptocorus species that adopted a balloon vine species and also evolved longer proboscides. So these provide very fascinating studies to get to some generality in any aspect that we want to study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. So what would your advice be to early career researchers interested in studying the evolutionary ecology of invasive species?
I think like all research, I would urge people to stick to the most interesting and pertinent questions in evolution and ecology. And in the end, it is really about the passion of what it is that you study. So if you really believe in your research field and the questions that you are interested in answering, then you're already on the right path. I don't think research should be prescriptive as such.
Jaco, your research undoubtedly led to many unforgettable moments and memories during your fieldwork. Can you share a particularly memorable moment with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all can agree that we spend less time in the field than we would like to. We always want to be in the field, and every moment in the field is always magic. There's a few things that stand up if I need to think about it. The one time I was working in Kruger National Park in South Africa, collecting soil samples from underneath invasive Opuntia stricta and carrying a very heavy esky full of soil samples, about 100 kilograms or so around. And the next moment, 3 lions ran literally like 20 meters away from us, past us. And I thought to myself, wow, this is a very interesting moment to witness right here, standing with a cooler box full of sand surrounded by lions. Well, that would be a very memorable moment.
I completely agree. Jaco, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.